It was around 3:15 a.m. when it happened. I'd been driving for about 6 hours straight, hauling a shipment of electronics from Chicago to Denver. Anyone who's done long haul knows this stretch of I-80 through Nebraska. Flat, endless, and at that hour, completely deserted. The kind of emptiness that makes your mind play tricks on you. I'd been fighting sleep for the last hour, windows down despite the October chill, radio blasting some late-night talk show about conspiracy theories. Ironically fitting, considering what was about to happen. My truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty road and the occasional reflective mile marker. I hadn't passed another vehicle in at least 45 minutes. That's how dead this stretch gets after midnight. The isolation never bothered me before that night. Now, it's all I can think about when I drive through rural areas after dark. I first noticed the headlights in my side mirror, maybe a half-mile back. Nothing unusual about that, though I remember thinking it was strange how they seemed to appear out of nowhere. One moment, empty darkness behind me, the next, headlights. The vehicle closed the distance quickly, too quickly. When the red and blue lights started flashing, I felt that familiar sinking feeling. Every trucker knows what a traffic stop costs in time and potentially money. I pulled over, grumbling to myself about how I hadn't been speeding and my logs were in perfect order. I went through the usual motions, turned on my interior lights, located my license and registration, rolled down my window. In my side mirror, I could see a figure emerge from what looked like a standard Highway Patrol cruiser, though something about the light hitting it made the color look off. Not quite right. At the time, I chalked it up to the weird way emergency lights play with perception at night. The officer approached my cab slowly, too slowly. His walk was strangely mechanical, like someone trying to imitate how a person walks without ever having done it themselves. Each step deliberate, arms barely swinging. When he reached my window, I got my first good look at him and immediately felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He looked like a highway patrolman, but everything was just slightly wrong. His uniform was correct in all the details, but it hung on his frame as if it were slightly too big. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost bluish under the interior light of my cab. But it was his eyes that really got to me. They were dark, so dark I couldn't distinguish pupil from iris, and he didn't blink. Not once during our entire interaction. "License and registration," he said, but his voice was wrong too. It was flat, emotionless, with a subtle electronic quality, like someone talking through a cheap speaker. His lips didn't quite sync with the words. I handed over my documents, trying to keep my hands steady. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" I was going under the limit. He stared at my license without really looking at it. No scanning motion of the eyes, just a fixed stare. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Still that same monotone voice. "There is something you need to see." Every instinct in my body screamed danger. In 15 years of driving, I've been pulled over plenty of times. Officers don't ask you to exit your vehicle to see something at 3 a.m. on a deserted highway. "I'd prefer to stay in my truck, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Could you tell me what this is about?" His head tilted slightly, not in a natural way, but at an angle that seemed almost mechanical. "You need to see, behind the vehicle. Important." That's when I noticed he hadn't used his flashlight once. Every traffic stop, they shine that blinding light in your face, your cab, your paperwork. This officer hadn't even carried one. "I'm going to need your badge number," I said, reaching slowly for my phone. That's when it happened. His face changed. There's no other way to describe it. It was like a digital image glitching, just for a split second. His features seemed to shift and rearrange before settling back. A brief flicker, like bad reception on an old TV. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty I was not dealing with a human being. My hand was on my phone now, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. The officer opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, headlights appeared in the distance behind us. Real headlights, approaching fast. The effect on the figure was immediate. His head snapped around to look at the approaching vehicle, with a movement no human neck could make. When he turned back to me, his expression had changed. There was something like frustration or anger there now, emotions that didn't quite fit the face they were on. like someone wearing a mask they couldn't control properly. "We will continue this another time," he said, his voice now carrying an unnatural echo. He turned and walked back to his patrol car with that same stiff gait, moving faster now. I watched in my mirrors as he got in and pulled away. No squealing tires or dramatic exit, just a smooth, eerily silent departure. The cruiser accelerated down the highway, but something was off about how it moved, too fluid, almost like it was hovering just above the asphalt. Within seconds, the vehicle disappeared around a bend. Not just out of sight, the taillights vanished too quickly, as if the car itself had simply ceased to exist after rounding the curve. I sat there gripping my steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened, when the approaching vehicle, an actual Nebraska Highway Patrol cruiser, pulled in behind me, lights flashing. The real officer approached with a flashlight, uniform properly fitted, movements naturally human. Officer Jenkins, according to his nameplate, was concerned to find a truck stopped on the shoulder. "Everything all right here?" he asked, shining his light briefly around the cab before respectfully pointing it away from my face. I hesitated, then decided to tell him everything. As I recounted my experience, his expression changed from professional concern to visible unease. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "What model was the patrol car?" he finally asked. I described it, similar to his but older, maybe early 2000s, with markings that weren't quite right. Officer Jenkins got on his radio and stepped away, speaking in hushed tones I couldn't make out. When he returned, his face was grim. "Sir, there are no patrol units assigned to this stretch tonight, except me. I'm only here because I was responding to a call about a truck stopped on the shoulder, called in anonymously about 10 minutes ago." My blood ran cold. "Someone called about me before I was even pulled over?" He nodded slowly. "Listen, I shouldn't be telling you this, but you seem genuinely shaken. This isn't the first report we've had. 3 times in the past 2 years, drivers reported similar encounters on this same stretch. Patrol car that isn't quite right, officer asking them to exit their vehicle to see something." I found my voice again. "What happened to those drivers?" "Those are just the ones who reported it," he said quietly. "We've had 7 drivers go missing on this stretch in the past decade. Trucks found abandoned, drivers never seen again. No evidence, no witnesses." He wrote something on a card and handed it to me. "This is my direct number. If you see anything like this again, or if anyone tries to contact you about tonight, call me immediately. Not 911, not the station. Me directly." Before leaving, he looked at me seriously. "I'd advise getting back on the road now. Don't stop again until you reach the truck plaza in Kearney. Stay where there are lights and people." I didn't need to be told twice. I drove straight to Kearney, my hands shaking the whole way. When I arrived, I parked under the brightest lights I could find and slept in my cab with the doors locked, even though I was well past my hours of service. 2 weeks later, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, there was nothing but static for several seconds. Then, that same monotone voice, "We still have something to show you." I hung up and called Officer Jenkins immediately. He told me they'd found another abandoned truck the previous night. Same stretch of highway, driver missing. I quit long-haul driving the next day. No job is worth that risk. I still drive locally, but only during daylight hours. And I never, ever stop for patrol cars on isolated stretches of highway without verifying they're real, by calling dispatch directly first. Whatever, or whoever, is out there on that lonely stretch of I-80, they're still waiting. Still pulling over trucks in the dead of night. Still asking drivers to step out to see something. And I can't help but wonder how many have said yes. I never used to believe in the paranormal. Growing up, I thought ghost stories were just made-up nonsense to scare kids or entertain people around campfires. That changed during my sophomore year of college when I was working the overnight shift at Taylor's Pharmacy, a 24-hour drugstore on the outskirts of town. I took the job because it fit perfectly with my class schedule. Work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., sleep until noon, then head to afternoon classes. The pay was decent, the different shifts made it better than most retail jobs, and the store was usually dead quiet after midnight, giving me plenty of time to study. My manager, Steve, was pretty laid back as long as I kept the front shelves stocked and helped the occasional insomniac or parent with a sick child who wandered in at 3 a.m. The store itself was nothing special, a typical chain pharmacy in an older building that had been renovated multiple times over the decades. The main floor had bright fluorescent lighting, wide aisles, and that distinct pharmacy smell of medication and cheap perfume samples. But the basement stockroom, that was different. From my first training shift, the basement gave me an uneasy feeling. It was a stark contrast to the well-lit sales floor, dim lighting with several bulbs perpetually burnt out, concrete floors stained with who knows what, and metal shelving units crammed with overstocked merchandise. The air down there was always noticeably colder than the rest of the building, and had a musty smell that the upstairs ventilation system couldn't quite eliminate. Steve brushed off my comments about the basement. "Old buildings settle," he'd say. "You get used to it." When I asked why they didn't improve the lighting, he laughed. "Budget cuts. Corporate won't approve maintenance unless something's completely broken." My duties included bringing up stock from the basement to refill shelves during quiet periods. For the first few weeks, everything was normal, or as normal as working alone at 3 a.m. in a near-empty store can be. Then things started happening that I couldn't easily explain away. The first incident occurred about a month into the job. I had gone down to get some cold medicine to restock the pharmacy section. I clearly remembered leaving 3 boxes of NyQuil on the middle shelf before heading upstairs with the rest. When I returned 20 minutes later for the remaining boxes, they weren't there. After searching the entire basement, I found them neatly stacked on a completely different shelf across the room. I told myself I must have been tired and forgot where I left them. But I knew that wasn't true. A week later, I was organizing the vitamin shipment when I felt a sudden, intense cold spot, much colder than the basement's usual chill. It was like walking into a freezer, except the cold area was only about 3 feet wide. I stepped in and out of it several times, baffled by the sharp temperature boundary. As I stood in that cold pocket of air, the hairs on my arms stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I hurried back upstairs and didn't return to the basement for the rest of that shift. These incidents continued and escalated. Items I had carefully arranged would be disorganized when I returned. Boxes would mysteriously fall from shelves with no apparent cause. The motion-activated lights at the far end of the basement would turn on when I was nowhere near them. Each time, I tried to find rational explanations, but they became increasingly implausible. Other employees noticed too. Maria, who worked evenings, refused to go to the basement alone after experiencing what she described as someone breathing down my neck when no one else was there. The daytime stock clerk, Terrence, complained about tools disappearing and reappearing in different locations. But management dismissed our concerns, attributing everything to forgetfulness or the building's old infrastructure. Then came the night that changed everything. It was about 3 months into my employment, around 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. The store was completely empty. Not a single customer had come in for over an hour. I needed to restock the feminine hygiene section and headed down to the basement. As I was gathering the products, the lights flickered 3 times in quick succession. I paused, waiting to see if they would stabilize. Instead, every single light in the basement went out simultaneously. Complete, absolute darkness. The emergency lights should have kicked in, but they didn't. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the exit sign near the stairs, too distant to be useful. I pulled out my phone and activated the flashlight function, cursing under my breath about the building's faulty wiring. As I turned to make my way back to the stairs, my light caught something in the far corner of the basement, an area we rarely used except for seasonal storage. There, standing perfectly still between 2 metal shelving units, was what appeared to be a person. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like dark clothing. In the limited beam of my phone flashlight, I couldn't make out distinct features, but it was unmistakably human-shaped. My first thought was that someone had broken in, maybe through the emergency exit that led to the alley behind the building. "Hello?" I called out, my voice betraying my nervousness. "The store's closed. You can't be down here." No response. "I'm going to call security if you don't leave." I bluffed, knowing full well our security consisted of outdated cameras and a panic button that connected to a call center. Still nothing. The figure remained perfectly motionless. I took a hesitant step forward, directing my flashlight more squarely at the form. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The light seemed to pass through parts of the figure, like it wasn't entirely solid. Fear gripped me, but I forced myself to take another step. "Who are you? What do you want?" The temperature around me plummeted suddenly. My breath became visible in front of my face. The flashlight on my phone flickered, and in that momentary darkness, I felt something brush past me. A cold sensation like someone running their fingers down my back. When my light stabilized, the figure was gone. I ran to the stairs, tripping over a box in my haste, and didn't stop until I reached the main floor. As I stumbled into the pharmacy area, the overnight pharmacist Diane looked up from her computer with concern. "Jesus, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. I explained what happened, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, her face grew serious. "You saw it too, then," she said quietly. Diane had worked at the store for 15 years. According to her, I wasn't the first employee to have an experience in the basement. She revealed that the building had been constructed in the late 1970s on land where an old psychiatric hospital once stood. The hospital had been demolished after a series of scandals involving patient mistreatment and several unexplained deaths. "Most people who work here long enough see something," she explained. "Management knows but tells us to keep quiet about it. Bad for business, you know." The next day, I asked Steve to show me the security footage from the basement. He was reluctant, but eventually agreed. What we saw chilled me more than the encounter itself. The video showed me entering the basement, gathering products, and then stopping suddenly when the lights went out. The footage, despite being grainy and in black and white, clearly showed me turning with my phone flashlight and walking toward the corner. Then, inexplicably, I started speaking, looking directly at what appeared to be an empty space between the shelves. On the video, there was nothing there. Absolutely nothing. Yet I was clearly talking to someone, my body language tense and frightened. The video showed me backing away suddenly and running to the stairs. Just before I disappeared from frame, the camera picked up a strange visual distortion in the corner where I'd been looking, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but in a distinctly human shape. A week later, 2 employees quit after having their own experiences. One claimed to have heard someone whispering his name from empty aisles. Another felt invisible hands pushing her toward the basement stairs. I considered quitting too, but the reality of tuition payments kept me there. I made a compromise with myself. I would never go to the basement alone again. If something needed restocking, it could wait for daylight hours or until another employee could accompany me. My research into the property's history revealed more than Diane had told me. The psychiatric hospital that once stood there had housed a ward for the criminally insane in its basement level, almost exactly where our stockroom was located. Records mentioned a patient who had died under mysterious circumstances in 1963, a tall, thin man who had been committed after killing his family. According to newspaper archives, his body was found in a corner of the basement ward with no apparent cause of death. It's been 2 years since my encounter. I still work at Taylor's Pharmacy, though I've switched to evening shifts when there are more people around. The incidents continue. Items moving, unexplained cold spots, occasional glimpses of something in the corner of your eye. New employees are never told about the building's history, but they figure it out quickly enough when things start happening to them. Management installed better lighting in the basement last year after too many complaints, but it hasn't stopped the occurrences. If anything, some employees swear the brighter lights make it easier to see the shadow figure that sometimes stands between the shelves, watching silently as they work. I don't go down there alone. Ever. Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. Some presences shouldn't be acknowledged. Whatever or whoever resides in our basement stockroom seems content to remain there, appearing occasionally to remind us that we're not alone in the building. The pharmacy remains open 24 hours, and on quiet nights when the wind howls outside and the old building creaks and settles, I sometimes catch myself glancing at the basement door, wondering if it's really just my imagination, or if something is standing at the bottom of those stairs, looking back up at me. I've always been good at working alone. That's probably why I lasted longer as the overnight custodian at Westlake Memorial Hospital than most people in that position. 3 years on graveyard shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. The pay was decent, and the solitude suited me. At least it did until last winter. Westlake is one of those hospitals that's been expanded so many times over the decades that it's become a maze. Newer sections built alongside original structures from the 1940s. Most of the hospital is modern and well-maintained. Gleaming floors, state-of-the-art equipment, motion sensor lighting. But then there's the East Wing. The East Wing was the original hospital building, built in 1943. Most of it had been renovated over the years, but the 5th floor remained largely untouched since the early 1980s, when those departments were relocated to the new North Tower. Now the East Wing's 5th floor mostly sat vacant, used primarily for storing outdated equipment and forgotten medical supplies. My cleaning route included a quick check of this floor once per shift, not a deep clean, just a walkthrough to ensure nothing was leaking, no pests had gotten in, and no homeless people had somehow found their way inside to seek shelter, which had happened twice before I started working there. For the first 2.5 years, my visits to the 5th floor were uneventful. Creepy, sure. The kind of standard creepiness you'd expect from an abandoned hospital wing with flickering fluorescent lights and rooms filled with dusty medical equipment. The air had that distinct smell of disinfectant that never quite fades, mixed with dust and the faint musty odor of aging building materials. The changes began gradually, so subtle at first that I questioned my own memory. One night in November, I noticed a wheelchair that seemed out of place. I was certain it had been against the wall near the elevator the night before, but now it was positioned in the middle of the hallway, facing one of the old patient rooms. I rolled it back to its usual spot, assuming one of the day shift maintenance workers had moved it while looking for something in storage. A week later, I found the same wheelchair in the middle of the hallway again, but further down the corridor. Again, I returned it to its place by the elevator, making a mental note to ask my supervisor if anyone else had been assigned tasks on the 5th floor. His answer was no. According to the maintenance schedule, I was the only one with any reason to be up there. Then came the footsteps. The first time I heard them, I immediately assumed another staff member was up there, despite what my supervisor had told me. The sound was unmistakable, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on the floor, moving unhurriedly down the hall around the corner from where I was mopping. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. "Maintenance. Anyone up here?" The footsteps stopped immediately. I rounded the corner, mop still in hand, expecting to find a nurse or doctor who had ventured up to retrieve something from storage. The hallway was empty. I checked every room along that corridor. Nothing. No one. I told myself it must have been the building settling, or sounds traveling up from the still active 4th floor. Old buildings make weird noises, especially hospitals with complex ventilation systems. But it happened again, and again. Always footsteps, always stopping when I called out or went to investigate. By the 3rd occurrence, a cold feeling of dread had settled in my stomach. I started dreading my 5th floor checks, rushing through them as quickly as possible. Then I started finding doors open. Doors I was certain I had closed the night before. Not just slightly open, but fully open, as if inviting someone to enter. Supply closets, former patient rooms, the old nurse's station, all open when they should have been closed. I mentioned these occurrences to Hank, the security guard who usually worked the same shift. He was an older guy, approaching retirement, who'd been at Westlake for over 20 years. "The 5th floor has always been strange," he said with a shrug. "Lots of staff refuse to go up there alone, especially at night. Too much history in those rooms." When I pressed him for details, he was vague but mentioned that the East Wing's 5th floor had once housed the terminal care unit. essentially where they placed patients who weren't expected to recover. Back before hospice care was common, Hank explained, that's where they put people to die. Some nurses claim the place is haunted by patients who passed there, but administration doesn't like us talking about it. Bad for morale, they say. I'm not, or wasn't, a superstitious person. I still tried to find logical explanations. Maybe the air pressure in the building was causing doors to open. Maybe other staff members were using the floor during day shifts and forgetting to return things to their proper places. Then came the night of January 14th. It was unusually cold, with a winter storm raging outside. The hospital was quieter than normal, even for the overnight shift. Many scheduled procedures had been postponed due to weather, and the eerie silence seemed to permeate the entire building. I delayed my fifth-floor check until almost 3 a.m., hoping to finish my other tasks first. When I finally took the service elevator up, I felt an immediate sense that something was different. The air was colder than usual, so cold I could see my breath, which made no sense since the heating system should have been functioning normally. As I pushed my cleaning cart out of the elevator, the fluorescent lights flickered more intensely than usual, creating disorientating strobing effects down the long corridor. I almost turned around right then, ready to report a potential electrical issue instead of completing my check. I wish I had. I was halfway down the main corridor when I saw someone walking slowly ahead of me, moving away toward the north end of the wing. It was a figure in a pale blue hospital gown. Clearly a patient, though how they'd gotten up to this floor was beyond me. The person was thin, with gray-white hair, moving with the tentative gait of someone elderly or unwell. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. "Sir, this area is closed. Can I help you find your way back to your room?" The figure didn't respond, but continued walking slowly away from me. Concerned that this was a confused patient who might hurt themselves in this abandoned area, I followed, pushing my cart to the side of the hallway to retrieve later. "Sir, please wait. You shouldn't be up here. It's not safe." The figure turned right at the end of the hall, into what had once been the intensive care section. I quickened my pace, worried now. That section had uneven flooring where renovations had been started but never completed, a tripping hazard for anyone, especially a disoriented patient. When I reached the corner, I saw the figure entering a room at the very end of this secondary hallway, room 572. The door closed behind them with a soft click. I hurried to the door, now genuinely worried. I knocked firmly. "Hello? Hospital maintenance. I need you to open the door, please. You're in a restricted area." No response. I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked. To my surprise, it turned easily. I pushed the door open, reaching for the light switch just inside. Room 572 was completely empty, except for an old hospital bed frame and a decommissioned heart monitor. There was nowhere anyone could be hiding. No bathroom, no closet, just the empty room with its peeling paint and dusty floor. The window was sealed shut and covered with security bars installed decades ago. My heart pounding, I backed out of the room. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe the patient had somehow slipped past me in the hallway while I was entering the room. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing after weeks of heightened anxiety about this floor. I practically ran back to my cart and finished my check in record time, skipping all but the most essential tasks. When I got back to the main floors, I immediately went to the security office where Hank was monitoring the cameras. "I need to see the fifth floor footage from the last 20 minutes, I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think a patient wandered up there somehow." Hank looked concerned and pulled up the security feed. We watched together as the recording showed me entering the fifth floor from the elevator, moving down the hallway, then suddenly stopping. The footage clearly showed me speaking to an empty hallway, then following nothing to room 572, eventually entering the room alone, then rushing back to my cart. "There's no one there, son," Hank said quietly. "Just you." I insisted that I'd seen someone, described the patient in detail. Hank's face grew increasingly troubled as I spoke. "Room 572, he finally said, was where they used to place patients in their final hours. The ones with no family, no one to sit with them. Staff called it the departure room." I didn't sleep that day when I got home. Instead, I researched the history of Westlake Memorial. Official records were sparse, but I found a local history blog with posts from former nurses and orderlies. One account described the fifth floor as a place where the veil between worlds thins, with multiple staff reporting encounters with patients who had passed away. Several mentioned room 572 specifically, and a patient who had died there in 1986. An elderly man with no family who had reportedly told nurses he was afraid of crossing over alone. According to the blog, staff occasionally reported seeing him wandering the halls after his death, always returning to room 572. I almost didn't go back to work the next night. Something kept me from quitting immediately. Skepticism, probably, or maybe just financial necessity. I convinced myself that stress and suggestion had caused me to hallucinate the entire encounter. My resolve lasted until my 3 a.m. check of the fifth floor. As the elevator doors opened, I immediately noticed something on the floor of the corridor. Wet footprints. Small, bare feet, the prints still glistening under the fluorescent lights. They led from room 572, down the main hallway, toward the double doors that connected to the main hospital building. I followed them slowly, my cleaning cart forgotten in the elevator. The footprints continued through the double doors, down the connecting corridor, and into the modern part of the hospital. They proceeded down another hallway, past the currently used patient rooms of the oncology ward 1 floor below. Then, in the middle of the hallway, they simply stopped. Not gradually fading, just a perfect final footprint, then nothing, as if whoever, whatever, had made them had simply vanished mid-step. I submitted my resignation the next morning. The HR representative tried to convince me to stay, offered me a different shift, even a slight raise. When I insisted, she finally sighed and handed me the paperwork. "You're not the first to leave because of the fifth floor," she admitted. "We probably should just seal it off completely." In my exit interview, the administrator asked if there was anything they could do to improve working conditions for the next person in my position. I had just one suggestion. "Room 572, I said. "Keep the door locked, always." She nodded slowly, making a note. "We try. It doesn't stay locked." I've been working at a small office building downtown for the past 8 months. Normal hours, well-lit spaces, no abandoned wings. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet hallway, I find myself listening for footsteps. And I always check to see if doors I've closed somehow open themselves again. Because once you've seen what I saw at Westlake Memorial, you never stop looking over your shoulder. Some boundaries between worlds are thinner than we think, especially in places where many have passed from one side to the other. And sometimes, those who were afraid to make that journey alone still walk the halls, looking for someone, anyone, to notice them, to acknowledge that they were here, that they existed, that they're still here, in their own way, waiting in room 572.